Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Mary LaPlante. I'm Vice President of Client Services for Digital Clarity Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our December Get Clarity webinar. Today we take a clear-eyed look at one of the hottest, most hyped, and most confusing challenges facing global organizations, the issues surrounding big data. Technology advancements and the widespread adoption of digital marketing practices have made it possible to collect lots and lots of data about customers and prospects, their preferences and their behaviors as individuals and as personas in the moment and shaped by past interactions. As analysts and consultants, we work daily with companies that recognize the potent value of that data as the key to delivering world-class customer experience. But our clients struggle with getting a foothold on that mountain of data. What's important? What specific information enables you to deliver that compelling experience? How do you separate the truly actionable data from information that's merely interesting? Where do you start? Is your organization ready to realize the return on investment in big data? This past summer, Digital Clarity Group set out to answer these and related questions with original primary research conducted under the direction of partner and principal analyst Allen Bonde. The research highlights and guidance based on analysis of the findings were published in November as a DCG report entitled Thinking Small, Bringing the Power of Big Data to the Masses. The report is available as a free download from the DCG website. You'll also receive a copy of the report as a follow-up to today's webinar. For those of you who might not be familiar with Digital Clarity Group, we are a research-based advisory firm focused on the technologies and practices that drive customer experience management in the digital age. Our clients are enterprise adopters, technology suppliers, and service providers who build and deploy solutions for CEM, customer experience management. We conduct and publish research, offer consulting services, and are recognized as thought leaders in the markets that we cover. A few housekeeping notes before we start. The webinar is being recorded. We will answer questions at the end, but you don't need to wait until the end to submit them. You can enter them in the question window at the lower right-hand side of your GoToWebinar console. Let me just move the slides here. There we go. Our big data expert is Allen Bonde, partner and principal analyst at Digital Clarity Group. Allen covers customer relationship management, social marketing, analytics, and rich media through the lens of customer experience management. He brings real-world experience to his analysis, having spent more than 20 years of his career as an enterprise software CMO. In today's webinar, Allen will provide an historical perspective on big data, illustrating that some of the foundational practices around big data have actually been part of the enterprise landscape for at least a decade. He will present a new framework for thinking about the most useful applications of customer data in the interaction cycle, and he'll provide us with a top 10 list of key points about the current state of big data adoption, giving you some great talking points to drive internal conversations with executives and colleagues. Allen, before we jump in, I thought maybe we could provide a little bit of context for our audience. What was the motivation behind the research? What was there about the current state of big data adoption that indicated to you that the time was right for a look at practical issues?
No, this is a great question, and thanks everybody for joining us. So it's interesting. I mean, I actually started my career 20-ish years ago. We'll leave it at that. As a data scientist and as a researcher, looking at predictive analytics and knowledge discovery in databases, and then fast forward to a number of my marketing roles, I've always had this view that as marketers, as operational leaders, we need data, right? We need it in our day-to-day tasks. It's how we manage our businesses. It's how we understand what customers are doing. I mean, there's some amazing capability that's out there, yet it's really only useful if we can apply it in an easy way in our day-to-day roles. And I think this is really the motivation for our study and for our whole theme around sort of how big data and analytics fits into the CEM context is we believe that the value comes from applying these insights in practical ways to the everyday roles that people have. And that was really the mission of the study, was to ask organizations, ask people, how are they taking this idea of big data and applying it in practical ways? How are they delivering that value to the masses of their employees and even to their customers? And number two, what types of tools are they using? How are they stitching together their solutions? That was really the focus of the research.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I know that in a slide or two, you're actually going to be talking about the findings coming out of the research. But before that, I think you're going to give us a little bit of overview of where we are today.
Exactly. So, you know, it's hard to capture all the stuff that's going on in the big data arena on one slide, but this is a quick sort of summary of both the stats, if you will. You know, everybody's doing it in terms of, you know, close to 90% of the Fortune 500 have a identified big data initiative. People are spending a significant amount of their technology and marketing and sales budgets on big data related activities to the point where this number is at least $10 billion. A new data point that's not on the slide but came out recently is the volume of venture investment within the big data sector. Just this past year was close to $3.6 billion, billion with a B. So clearly there's a lot of attention and focus just on the corporate side. Then you have all the consumer trends, and this is really something that got me thinking about not only big data but, you know, data delivered to consumers and individual users. So if you look at the buzz around things like Google Glass and around you know, new types of wearable devices and smartwatches, that the notion of small data as the data that's useful from a consumer perspective or an employee perspective, just the right data delivered in the format at the point in time to help people make a decision, or, you know, pick a restaurant or run faster to meet their goals or sell more to meet their sales goals, that this idea of small data versus big data became kind of interesting, at least worth exploring. And then, interestingly enough, I mean, somebody who's probably put big data on the map more than anybody else, Nate Silver, with his blog and with his projections about the election, when I saw him speak and actually had a chance to talk with him a few months back, you know, one of the things that he mentioned was pretty interesting, is the notion that, you know, big data creates little wins. And I think this is the theme for everything that we're doing, is how to help organizations orchestrate those little wins. What do they look like? And I think that's sort of the mission for the study, but also something that we started hearing both within the study and also just having conversations as we give talks and as we socialize with our partners and our clients. And I wanted to share a few of these themes because I think they set up the notion of how do we not only complete that last mile of big data, but how can we really create and deliver data that's actionable. And so some of these themes, and it's funny, it came out of these interviews that we did as part of our primary research, and they sort of resonated around, you know, what's the purpose of big data? So yeah, big data sounds interesting, but what does it mean for me or my group or my organization? How do I support everyday work? So just because we have a team of data scientists who are analyzing customer data, transactional data, and social data, how does that impact me in the everyday work that I do? For example, as a marketer, is that going to be practical to help me target my next campaign? How do I deliver the right data in the right format to all of my users? This was the whole idea of big data for the masses, sort of how we titled the study. That's key. It's thinking about what formats, what channels, you know, is this data going to be in a form that is in fact usable? And then probably the bottom line is the quote sort of on the right there. We need to do big data in small steps. This came through loud and clear as we talked to various people that, you know, yes, big data provides a theme and an imperative and maybe even a sense of urgency, but we have to chunk it down into small steps and in some cases chunk down the big data into small data. So let's dig in the next slide into sort of how we've framed our perspective. So as Mary said, this first bit of work culminated in a report that is available to everybody on the call and your colleagues. You know, it's been out in the market. We've been writing a number of op-ed type pieces. One actually came live today on CMO.com. If you want to check that out, that has sort of a discussion of some of the front matter and the sort of the history and how we got to the place where we are. I've done a number of other articles recently just socializing the idea of how can we bring the value to the masses, and that really was the theme for the research. But it builds on, I guess, a few observations. The first one is that if you think about all the investment in tools and databases and technology and data science, that's great, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient to create value. And we really believe that the notion of the last mile of big data, and we'll talk a bit more about what that looks like, is where the value is created. This is where users see benefit. It's where data is shared. It's where it's augmented. It's where it's socialized. This last mile of big data to us is the payoff for most organizations. So it doesn't mean that you don't need to worry about the miles before it, but rather that we have to at least keep one eye on the user requirements and what is really going to connect the masses of data if you're using big data, or even determine that maybe you don't need full-on big data, but rather there's selective small data or local data that's just as valuable for those specific roles, those specific tasks. That's point number one. Number two is most folks know about the 3 V's of big data. We need to focus beyond sort of the mechanics and focus on sort of the 4th V, if you will, which I would say is value. From my perspective, a lot of this research was done from the lens of a marketer. So not only my perspectives having played the CMO role, but also a number of our constituents are coming at this from the delivery of customer experiences or better campaigns or digital strategies. So we think that marketing needs to play a key role. If you think about kind of the history of technology being pulled into organizations, whether it's data processing or internets or social, a lot of that has come through marketing. And so I think the case is it's true here as well with big data, that marketing needs to play a key role and has to be equal parties in the discussion of your strategy of what we're going to invest in and how those are going to result in tools that might be useful by marketing, or maybe marketing will help package them. In terms of a framework, one of the core things that we looked at is the notion of immediacy of data. So what does that mean? Immediacy is the notion that do I need it really real time, or is more trending information good enough? And so when we started framing out the use cases that are presented in the research, we looked at the notion of immediacy both in terms of data access. So do I need real-time data to make my decisions, or is trending historical information really what I'm talking about, versus immediacy of consumption? So as a marketer, as a salesperson, as an operations person, do I need to am I making real-time decisions, spontaneous decisions, or is it data really to support planning? If you think about that creating sort of a 2x2, it informs not only our use cases, but it also, I think, shifts the conversation rightfully to not only what types of data, but does the data have to be real-time, or is this notion of real-time data kind of oversold? And that's a whole different discussion, but I think once you start thinking about immediacy requirements both on the source side and the consumption side, it allows you to be a lot more practical and pragmatic about what data is required to drive what types of decisions. And then finally, look at what's happening on the consumer side. I mean, increasingly the consumer roles and business roles are blending, right? I mean, look at the evolution of the smartphone or the tablet within large organizations. Clearly, those are devices that we initially used, for the most part, as consumers, and then we've brought them within the business environment. I think that the same thing is going to happen in terms of data-driven applications, that a number of the consumer analogs apply very well within the business and vice versa. So that allows us to think about big data and small data from more of the perspective of practical, easy-to-use, shareable, and in some cases fun applications, as opposed to the traditional transactional reports and things like that. So if we take that view, we look at tapping our existing data. I'm a big proponent for not necessarily saying you need to acquire more data, but look at how you can use your existing data sources. And then you can embrace this idea of small data, which I'm going to cover in the next few slides. That, to us, is the key to delivering not only adoption, but also ROI from the business perspective.
That's a great summary, Alan, and I actually do want to come back to a couple of these. I know that when we have talked with some of our clients, they really get interested in this notion of immediacy versus trending, and maybe we'll talk about that in the Q&A. But aside from that, when you were doing the research, was there anything really surprising in the findings?
So there's always an element of, I think, what you expect to see versus what you discover in any kind of research like this. I think there's a couple things that were maybe a bit of a surprise. First is that there was a pretty consistent view that there needs to be a focus on this last mile and practical apps. I didn't see a whole lot of disagreement with that. Now, then again, I was talking more to operational strategy, marketing people versus technical people. Perhaps if I was speaking more to technical people, they would be pitching more for, big data is about more data and more systems capability, et cetera. So that's maybe a prize or not. The other thing is that I think we forget that people are still relatively early in their social media, their social business, their social data collecting, and that's always a surprise. I have to remind myself that social is still a new emerging area, and even if organizations just focused on getting a handle on their social data, they could do a lot of interesting things, even if it's not even proper big data. So I think that's always a surprise, is to remember that organizations aren't all early adopters and they aren't all technically savvy and they haven't just nailed the whole social part of the equation. So it's good to remind ourselves that there's a lot of us who are still getting our arms around just the social part.
Right, and yet there's a lot of pressure to be completely changing everything about customer experience management today.
Yes. Yeah, that's the trick, right, is the sense of urgency sort of runs smack up against the reality of there's a lot of moving parts that's required to really make fundamental change. So I think, the trick here and one of the lessons and what I'll focus on is how do we chunk down that problem so we can make incremental improvement. We can do things in a smart way, but in a lot of cases a local way that's additive and gets value from that particular initiative or task, but is still on the journey, on the map to the ultimate, customer experience. So that, speaking of maps, one of the things I wanted to share from the report, and there's a full-on version of this within the report, is the notion that we've been on a journey that hasn't happened overnight. And I think people think about big data as this new thing, but rather the terminology might be new, the players may be new and evolving, but this has been a 25-year journey at least. I mean, when I started working in analytics and R&D in the early 90s, I mean, we were pretty far along in terms of developing algorithms for understanding patterns within databases and trying to see if we could create, insights from large data stores, say, of like telecom records, and figure out would certain customers be more receptive to certain offers, or would they be likely to churn in the next go-round. This has been building for a while. And there's really a few kind of generations, I think, at play. There was the initial sort of data analytics, big data coming out of the transactional world, which resulted in transactional reporting engines and report builders. That's even preceding this. It's sort of the part of the chart that didn't fit on the slide here. So we had sort of a transactional wave, then we had kind of an online and social wave. The famous Doug Laney 3V's paper, believe it or not, is a dozen years ago. When we started framing out kind of what are the ingredients that go into big data. Then in the mid-2000s, we saw a lot of the foundational tools come along, between BIRD and Hadoop and some of the open source initiatives. Again, that's like coming up on a decade ago. We had things like Nate Silver's visibility on the consumer side. We had much more of a, business awakening to big data, and when people like McKinsey start to do major reports on this data of a technology, that it's starting to hit the mainstream. So McKinsey's kind of seminal report on big data happened in 2011, and then you've seen this acceleration happen. And I think what's interesting is as we've gone through the social era, as social has gone more mainstream, you have sort of web data plus social data plus transactional data. We've seen a number of acquisitions. We've seen a number of consumer applications become the new exemplars for what this could look like from a delivery perspective. And if you follow this timeline, we went from definition through foundation through acquisition, and now we believe that this next wave is much more about the user, is much more about looking at consumer apps and using them as the model. And that's why I've started to write about the notion of, in 2014, if the focus continues on more functional use of big data, more consumer-inspired devices, this really has the potential to be the year of small data. And as we'll talk about, there's a number of reasons, both practical as well as technological, why we believe this is the case. The last point on this on this timeline, and I think it also puts a historical frame around it, is that this isn't either or. So I love the idea of big data. That's where I came from. I know the potential for being able to discover and model and simulate and come up with new insights when you have massive computing applied to massive data sets. So don't get me wrong, I think that has huge value. The challenge is how to deliver that value to the masses of the non-data scientists, the organizations that don't have those resources. And I think the quote here from Tom Davenport I love, because this is really the practical approach. It's the notion that organizations need to transitioning to an integration of their big and their small data. And in some cases, it's going to start with small data. In some cases, it'll start with big data. But the point is, we need all of these data sources applied in practical ways so that we can just do a better job with our day-to-day tasks. I think that's the takeaway. So let's go to the next slide here and talk about, at least at a high level, how this is going to happen. So there's another key component of the research that looked at, okay, if people are excited, they're aligning with the vision of big data, and they're focused on making it practical, making it actionable. How are they doing that? So the notion of this data funnel came out of the research. So, you know, you've got kind of big data to small data. That's sort of the simplified view. Certainly we can create small data without big data, but if you follow the analogy here that everything sort of starts at the top, we have three primary sources. We have transactional data, we have our social data, we have our online data. These multiple data sources are sort of fused together. There's a process of kind of collecting and managing this through, say, social listening, through MDM, through online, web tracking, behavioral tracking, and there's, a tool bench here for our analysts to model and to assemble and to process this data so that it's ready to be turned into applications that are practical. That happens at the next layer. And so what happens in this composing layer, this is where your campaign tools are. This is where your app builders are. This is where your collaboration tools are. I'm a big believer in social playing at least two primary roles within this whole big data to small data. One is as a source, of course, that there's lots of data coming from social channels that can inform our understanding of customer behavior, even of employee behavior. Two is social as a delivery channel for creating and delivering and operationalizing insights. So the notion of collaboration, I think, is a huge opportunity, whether you're a tool that's providing, a way to analyze and deliver data and layer in collaboration into that tool environment. So say you have a team of analysts that are collaborating around a particular campaign, or the notion of being able to add to and socialize. So maybe you have a particular report or you have a particular dashboard, making it really, really easy for people to share and comment and add. So I think social is important, at least on those two dimensions, as a source, whether you're using a listening tool or as a vehicle to deliver better insights, because you're essentially crowdsourcing around it. Now, what's the bottom of this funnel? So if we're starting with all of our different data sources, or one or more of them, to me, the punchline is delivering this and connecting that insight to a particular task, role, function. And that's the notion of small data. So it might manifest itself as an alert. I'm a salesperson. I've wired up my my CRM so that I can get an alert when somebody is looking at my proposal or browsing a certain part of the site. That alert that's sent to me that says, hey, this prospect just did that. Now you should call them. That's small data in action. It could be an app. It could be a specific tool that pops up that says, here's a way that you can analyze the data that you need. In the world of consumer, Kayak's when-to-book tool is a perfect example of an app that chunks all this data, historical pricing data. They have sort of their magic formula. But what does it pop up? It just pops up a little trending chart, and it pops up buy or wait. So to me, that's a perfect example in the consumer world of an app that makes it super simple, very functional for me as a traveler to look at their data, to look at the trend if I want to see that, but really just to follow the instruction. Buy it now with 80% confidence, or wait because it's going to go down. That's a perfect example of an app. The same thing with dashboards and with offers. Offers could be a flash sale in the e-commerce environment where that data is distilled down in terms of the inventory, the loyalty points that you have, the time of day, the seasonality, all that stuff, it pops up in an offer that kind of seems like magic when you get it. That's small data. Now, small data is more than that, which is why I have our definition. So as part of the study, we also set out to define what we mean. And I think it's important to think about this because it really directs a lot of what people need to be doing with either their big or small data. So what's small data? Small data connects people with timely, meaningful insights. And again, that could be derived from big data or local small data. So small data doesn't necessarily require big data, but in a lot of cases it benefits from big data. It's organized and packaged, and this is the role of the analysts, the architects, the designers. They're not going away. They're in the job of organizing and packaging it, often visually, so sometimes or many times a picture's worth 1,000 words, as they say, or a picture's worth 1,000 data points, to be accessible, understandable, and actionable for everyday tasks. And this, to me, is the mantra for big and small data. To make it useful, it has to be accessible, so I need to be able to get to it. It has to be understandable, so I have to know what it means and how to play around with it, but mostly it has to be actionable. And actionable not just in general, but when you talk about taking action, it's for an everyday task. So this is very different than, sort of data science and coming up with, a new drug or a new economic forecast or a prediction about the election that will pop out an answer, in 6 months, and maybe you get access to that if you're really important, or most likely you won't. It's about doing this at a time scale so that you get value for your everyday tasks. Now, if you're a vendor or a service provider, and we have a mix of people on this call, the trick, I think, is, and this is grossly simplified, but as a vendor or service provider, you have sort of 3 primary goals across this funnel. One is to help people integrate these different data sources. Because if it's not integrated, you're just going to have a bunch of stovepipe systems and it's not going to be very useful. I think your also opportunity is to partner and to tie together some of those collecting and processing tools. And then from the end user perspective, you can't be simple enough. If you look at some of the tools that have done really well, both in terms of consumer adoption and corporate adoption, and people that come to mind, some of Adobe's tools, HubSpot's tools, Salesforce's tools, people like that have done a really good job of simplifying and making solutions very function-oriented and not trying to deliver everything to everybody. I think that's the key here.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that really strikes me when you were talking about the specific use cases and looking at everyday tasks, it really, at the bottom of this funnel, it's very much about a specific interaction. So how do we use those small data? How do we use small data for things like alerts, like apps, dashboards, offers specifically? So to me, this implies, Alan, that as companies operationalize small data and focus on the narrow end of the funnel, there's going to be need for a look at how small data operates in specific domains. And I think on the next slide, we've got a look at maybe where some additional research is going to be happening.
No, this is a great lead-in because you're exactly right. How you operationalize this, how you empower data-driven processes. I mean, the notion of data-driven marketing, for example, is becoming pretty popular. I think that there's some natural places to focus. And again, the trick is, data can do anything. Big data or small data can do virtually anything. Part of the research was using the notion of immediacy and a marketing lens to identify some of those kind of starter or beachhead use cases. And that's really one of the things that's directing our research going forward. So for example, one of those use cases is the notion of campaign targeting, which is a very popular, if you look at what people are aiming to do with big data or analytics or data in general, targeting of campaigns, offers, content is incredibly important right now. It's how you cut through the clutter. It's how you reach customers sort of natively versus in the clunky old kind of a way. So I think data from the perspective of either sales operations or marketing campaigns, and then using data to bridge that divide. I mean, everybody's experienced sort of the natural tension between a sales organization, a marketing organization. To me, the common language, the common need is lead generation and demand generation. And if you can use data to generate either more leads or better leads or more and better leads, that does a lot to bridge this sort of sales and marketing divide. So that's one of the things that we really want to drill into a little bit more, building on our use cases. Same thing with the future role of the CMO. And I've had a number of interesting conversations. I was on a SAP radio show with Jonathan Becker, their CMO, a few months back. We talked about sort of the future CMO being one part a storyteller, one part a brand architect, one part a data analyst. I have mixed feelings about really whether most CMOs want to be a data analyst or whether they just need a smart team that has data analysts on that team. But there's no doubt that CMOs are becoming and have to become more data-driven, whatever that means. Maybe small data is perfect for the CMO, yet they have to have a team that's very versed in big data and predictive analytics and the like. So that's another topic. And then getting into the functional areas. So back to the point that we made at the beginning, big data has to have a purpose. It's kind of like for what? And I think that there's a particular opportunity within the front office space in general, and this has been my focus in terms of looking at the evolution of CRM and how that relates to CEM. But there's at least 3 areas that are particularly interesting. So the notion of small data for online commerce, so making more specific recommendations, making more specific offers, understanding sort of the path to purchase, optimizing that path to purchase. That's a very active area of research and a very interesting area, and one that has a lot of value if you can convert more of your online visitors into loyal, happy customers. Small data for sales, for example, I think there's some very interesting things going on with sales productivity, alerts, prospecting, connecting kind of inbound marketing to inbound selling with some of the stuff that HubSpot's doing. So small data for sales is another focus area. And then small data for field marketing, bringing in kind of the notion of data that may in fact be locally oriented, maybe mobile enabled. Even the whole notion of data in the trade show arena is pretty interesting as well. So there's these functional drill downs that we want to do. And then in terms of a next major study, and I just sort of foreshadowed it, with this first report, we really focused on the enterprise and how organizations are internally, for the most part, looking at bringing the value, the promise of big data to the masses of their employees. What I think we want to do next, and this is our plan, is to look at sort of the external side of that, and specifically the notion of social, local, mobile data, and how those insights and content and offers can enhance the consumer experience, while they're out and about on their cell phones, as they're in a shop on their phone or at a kiosk. We really want to turn the lens outside the organization, even though this experience may be shaped by the same team of marketers, but look at what types of data can be tapped, especially from a mobile perspective, from a social perspective, to create a similar type of effect that we're seeing inside the organization with the rollout of new types of business intelligence and reporting tools. So that's really our focus from a go-forward plan. Although, like everything, we're going to continue to adjust this based on what feedback we're getting and what requirements we're getting as well.
Sure. All your talk about online commerce and retail and marketing is making me realize how far behind I am in my Christmas shopping. So.
Oh man, you and me both.
But one thing, it's good to put the small data agenda out here, and just for the folks who are listening in today, this fits nicely. Alan's work is going to fit nicely into Digital Clarity Group's larger 2014 research agenda, which is really going to be focused over the next 12 to 18 months on making customer experience management a reality. Small data and analytics and social marketing is a part of that. But going forward, our bigger picture is really going to be helping digital marketers, customer experience champions, marketing technologists, and business leaders really figuring out how to put all the pieces together to make CEM a reality, because the pressures are certainly there. Alan, let's tie together the threads that have been discussed in the webinar. I think you've done a great job of putting together a top 10 list here, so let's walk through this for our audience.
So this is actually a piece that I did a couple weeks back in ZDNet that's had a lot of social chatter. There's been like 400 social shares of this when I last looked, around the notion of, okay, everybody kind of gets the promise of big data, as we've talked about, but what are some specific reasons if we need to sell this within our organization? Maybe we're just getting started with the notion of big data, and hey, now you're saying it's small data. What's that all about? So what I did in that piece, and I thought it'd be interesting to sort of summarize our discussion with this top 10 list, because I think it outlines what are some of the essential drivers, as well as what are some of the things we need to focus on as we take this, again, vision and try to turn it into some practical steps that we can apply, tomorrow and next week, and help operationally, not just strategically. So, out of that piece, right off the top, is big data is hard, right? Everybody, if you're working with it, if you're trying to hire data scientists, if you're trying to invest in the next tools, again, the potential is awesome, yet that trickle down from investment to value on the front line can take a long time. So I think that we need to at least focus on these other things as much as we're doing on big data. Number two, we have a lot of the data already at hand. Small data is all around us. It's the digital breadcrumbs that we leave. It's the check-ins on our mobile device. It's the social comments. It's the likes. It's the marketing analytics that we can look at in terms of our campaigns. So really, small data is all around us. We might as well take advantage of that data. It also is essential to the new CRM. So I'm building out some research around kind of what's next for CRM in this digital engagement world, and small data is going to be informing the new kind of rich profile that blends transactional, historical data with web performance data with social data. Small data is going to be sort of the operating system, I believe, for the next CRM. A couple other highlights here. Data-driven marketing is coming fast. It's going to be driven by big and small data. We have lots of consumer examples. There's a lot of hype about wearables and smartwatches and the like, but those examples, maybe you're not going to run out and get one of those, but we should think about what that device means and how that can be translated into an enterprise environment. For example, if you know or use the Nike Fuel Band, the first example I give people when I talk about small data is, what's being displayed on that little device. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could display, sales data or performance data or business data if we're running a factory, and use the same form factor, but yet use it to deliver just the essential piece of information that allows me to make the right decision or a smart action. The platform vendors are starting to get behind this. The good news is you've got folks like, Oracle and SAP and Salesforce and the larger vendors who are, talking not only about big data, but increasingly about small data. You've got a number of tool vendors that are absolutely messaging and starting to align with the thread. For example, the study that we did this summer, we did in partnership with not only Adobe, but also Actuate and HubSpot and Visible. So you have a number of tool vendors who are thinking about this whole kind of last mile of big data and how they can differentiate by presenting dashboards or presenting new ways to look at social data, et cetera. And then, number 10 is simple sells that we can drive adoption if we can simplify the value proposition, but also we can simplify the presentation of this data. So data is all around us. It's big, it's small, it's of all sizes. But if we can focus on how we turn those insights into action, that's the trick.
One of the things that really strikes me when I look at this list is that it reinforces the notion that the current state of big data, big data really is evolutionary rather than revolutionary. And, I think your map earlier on in the presentation reinforced that too. There are a lot of foundational things our companies have been doing for a long time that are coming together here.
No, I think that's exactly right. And if you look at any of the other major, I guess, technology waves, we could say the same thing about, when the internets and extranets and the internet came along, it didn't just appear on the scene. It sat on top of networking and personal computing and the like. I think big data is very much a progression of innovation in not only computing, but also in analytical tools and visualization and social listening and a lot of things. And I think you're exactly right that there's there's a good chance that you already have a number of these components in place. And I think our message to the audience that maybe is overwhelmed by the idea of big data, not to mention small data, is that you already have a number of pieces in place. And I think, my ultimate message to people is thinking about, the promise of big data. Don't get too overwhelmed with that idea, but focus in instead on what existing data assets we have. How are they being applied? How can we add to them? Are they being easily shared? I think if we start to chunk down the problem, that's the whole notion of thinking small and think locally and think about local functions, actors, evangelists, that we can come up with some interesting data-driven applications. Maybe they might wind up being kind of classic small data or classic big data, but if we chunk down the problem, that's the trick. And the good news is, if we go to the next slide, that there are a number of resources to give us guidance for doing that. So, for example, we've been writing, myself and Robert Rose and a number of others on the team have been writing a fair amount on the Just Clarity blog about how we can start to take this practical view of big data. So it's not like we just discovered this overnight. We've been thinking about this and writing about it for the last at least year and a half. We also have started to see this as a topic area within different events. So just this list of events here, I've either done panels or talks. We have a session coming up at Adobe Summit in March. We think that there's going to be an additional sort of groundswell of interest around this idea. And that's also reflected in some of the media, the articles. You know, if you search on small data, you're going to see that there was a spike starting about 9 months ago, and more people are starting to work that into the narrative about big data. Some of it's, I think, to be, you know, contrarian for sure, but some of it's also realizing that to make this valuable, we have to take this sort of local view, this operational view, and I think that's the key. And the good news is that there's now, you know, a year and a half of writing and research, not only from DCG but from others in the market that are starting to take this more practical bent. And I think that's incredibly important for us all to, you know, turn this from a good idea into stuff that we can actually act on, you know, in our day-to-day jobs.
Right. Okay, we're going to have time for a couple of questions. So anyone in our audience who would like to pose a question to Alan, please use the questions panel on the right-hand side of your console. And I'm going to put some pointers up. As we mentioned, the Small Data Research Report is available as a free download from the Digital Clarity website, but attendees will receive a copy when we follow up. Alan's contact information is on the slide, and to learn more about our team and the services we provide, there's our main URL. Alan, I actually have a question while our audience is sorting through theirs, and my question has to do with adoption readiness. In your work as a consultant and doing this research, you know, what are some of the signals that you look for when you're talking with an organization that they're well positioned to have some near-term success with a small data initiative? What are the signs that they're on the path for near-term ROI?
I mean, the funny thing is, I think whether people have a corporate big data, quote-unquote, initiative is less of an indicator than if they're actively, for example, harvesting their social data, if they have distinct roles on their teams to look at you know, social discussions, look at their web data. Have they started to, I guess, uncover the value in their analytics in general? And I think those are very good signs that there's a degree of confidence that that's where there's value, but they have yet to sort of connect the dots maybe between data that's sitting in a transactional system, within a social listening system, and in a web you know, monitoring or web analytics system. So I tend to look for the pockets of where there's a team or individuals that are seeing the value in one of those data sources, and they're starting to look at ways to stitch things together. The other, I guess, indicator would be organizations that, and I guess there's certain industries that are more so the case than others, but you know, how in tune are they with you know, the competitive landscape? Are they really trying to put together, for example, personas for their customer base? Are they starting to do more sophisticated things with segmentation, personalization, and the like, from either a web content management or from an e-commerce perspective? I think that those are also good signs that organizations are thinking about this. And again, the missing ingredient may be either putting some program structure around it or attaching, you know, a sponsor that maybe can cross-pollinate between something that a marketing team is doing, a sales team wants to do, an operations team wants to do. And in that case, it's less about starting these initiatives. It's more about sort of cross-pollinating. So I think those are a couple things I look at, both in terms of what you're doing with social. Are they aware of the social data and that value, as well as are they essentially trying to do things like, you know, viewing their customer base in a more sophisticated way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the issue of cross-functional processes and how people collaborate on all of this and where the piece parts of the data picture live in the organization, I often see that as, in my own work at DCG, sort of as a real issue for some companies, that cross-functional collaboration.
And that's not easy, right? I think the trick is to have a strong vision sponsorship that we need to be doing this sort of at a macro level, but we know that nothing really happens until it happens locally. And I think that happened with, back to my early analyst days, intranets were the big thing. This is, in the mid and late 90s, and you couldn't really dictate to an organization, we're now going to roll out an intranet. It happened organically via an engineering group or a marketing group or a support group. And once those local successes happened, then there was sort of momentum for creating more of a corporate initiative. I think that's exactly the case here. Now, it's sort of the opposite is happening with some of the top-down big data is, the big vision, the big strategy is happening, and then people expect that, there's going to be local value. I think we have to think back to how intranets, extranets, e-commerce rolled out, or even in some cases social rolled out. It happened locally. It happened with local projects and local actors and local evangelists, and until you have sort of that grassroots support, I don't think it really works. The challenge, of course, is if big data is the sole focus and there's an exclusive group of kind of data scientists, smart Alex, that kind of own that and control it, I don't think you can do the local stuff. So I think that's the caution is don't make this just the domain of the technologist. My point before is that at a minimum, the marketing team, maybe some other parts of the organization have to be co-owners of big data, even if they're not going to be the technologists, and that will force this sort of balance between global centralized big data versus kind of local decentralized small data, and that's the whole point of small data, is making it really by and for the people as opposed to a small group that sort of dictates what insight, what tools you get when they say you can get them.
Right. We have a question from someone in our audience. I'm going to read this as is because it's pretty clear. How do you see big data / small data affecting business-to-business marketing compared to business-to-consumer marketing?
So this is a terrific question because many of the examples, whether you're talking about social data or small data, come out of the business-to-consumer world. But if you think about sort of the way that business-to-business is happening these days, yeah, it's becoming more like consumer-type business, but I think the difference is the data that we may be tracking and collecting is going to be more biased to channel partners, to influencers, to the value chain on the business-to-business side versus simply the buyer and seller within the consumer world. Now, what's similar is if you think about consumer connectors, so to speak, in a tipping point kind of way, or consumer tastemakers or recommenders, that role in the consumer world translates very much to the role in the business-to-business world where sales cycles are longer and you're calling your favorite analyst to get their validation and you're interested in what they're saying about your product because that's essential to the decision process. I think that there's differences, but those differences are becoming less over time. And I think, again, on the business-to-business side, I would be sort of pointing my data collection more at the channel and the influencers than necessarily directly at consumers of those products versus on the consumer side where you're going to gain almost all of your insight from directly reading the signals from consumers.
Right. And I think on the business-to-customer or business-to-consumer side, there are a number of additional transactions or interactions that combine that go into a cycle to do conversion, probably more than B2B.
Absolutely.
Would you think that's the case?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, okay. We have one really straightforward question. Earlier in your slide, you had a reference to 3 V's. You mentioned the 4th V, which is value. We have one question. What are the other 3 V's?
Volume, variety, velocity. So
okay.
Those V's, again, characterizing kind of the core characteristics of big data. They're fine and great and all, but I think that they're missing that 4th V, which is really how is it delivered into the eventual end user. So this is a general, I guess, soapbox point I have, which is, again, big data is great, but too often it's been focused on the tools, the databases, the technologies, not enough on the end user experience, et cetera. And that's really the whole point of small data, is getting that focus, at least having a mix of focus between the systems and the people who are ultimately receiving the offers or dashboards or advice or what have you. So this small data builds on the whole big data wave, but in some cases a small data mindset may allow people to think that, wow, maybe we don't need, the point's not getting more data, the point's getting close to the right data. So in that case, maybe we replace some of those other V's, but not quite yet.
Right, right, and that brings to mind your funnel drawing with the emphasis on how much value there is at the bottom of the funnel, where the real business, where the real interactions are taking place, and how well can small data inform those and shape them.
Exactly.
Right, right. I don't see any other questions coming in from our audience. We're almost at the top of the hour in any case. Any final remarks for our audience?
You know, my point of view is you've got a lot of these pieces already. So I think if the small data framing helps motivate people to think about what data they have at hand, you know, to setting up a social listening program or a directed, you know, analytics initiative, and really kind of thinking globally but acting locally, that's really the mission. That's the goal for, I think, the opportunity. And if you buy into the notion and the nomenclature of small data, that's awesome. I think it's a vehicle to help people sort of focus on the important problems. But even if you're still, you know, your goal, your aspiration is big data, I think chunking it down, focusing locally, thinking globally is still a really useful exercise, even if, you know, the end goal is still going to look like big data. I think if you focus on those local applications, users, tasks, you're going to wind up with a big data initiative that has a lot more and happier customers.
Right, right, right. You know, one of the things with Digital Clarity Group we always strive for in our Get Clarity series, whether it's a webinar or newsletter, is really to give our audiences and our readers a set of talking points to take back to the conference table when all the stakeholders in an initiative come together. So I think the combination of the historical map, I think the look at the sales funnel and your top 10 list, hopefully our audience today will take back a lot of visuals and frameworks to be talking to their fellow stakeholders with when it comes to big and small data. So thanks everybody for joining us today. Contact information is on the slide in front of you. Don't hesitate to contact us if you have any further questions. We'll follow up with a copy of the report. And thanks for joining us, and happy holidays.
Thanks, everyone.